Willie Fluky Stokes ran a drug operation that pulled in roughly $1 million a week on Chicago's South Side, while telling the IRS he was an unemployed professional gambler. When his son was murdered in 1984, he buried him sitting upright in a custom Cadillac-shaped coffin with blinking headlights and cash tucked between his fingers, a funeral that made national news and inspired a Stevie Ray Vaughan song. 2 years later, Fluky was gunned down too, set up by the one man he paid to protect him. This is the story of an empire built on image and how it collapsed from the inside. William Morris Stokes was born on December 12, 1937, and on Chicago's South Side, everyone just called him Fluky. In the 1970s and into the mid-1980s, he was impossible to miss. Silk suits, diamond rings the size of silver dollars, gold bracelets stacked on both arms, and a diamond-studded letter F hanging from his neck. He drove multiple Cadillacs, including a custom convertible with a vanity plate that read Fluky 2. When he walked down 47th Street, people stopped what they were doing. He shook hands, remembered names, and handed out $50 and $100 bills like they were nothing. Elderly women got turkeys at Thanksgiving. Families about to be evicted found their back rent paid, sometimes a year in advance. If a family's house burned down, Fluky found them a new one. If neighborhood kids wanted to play organized ball, Fluky sponsored the team. That was the version of Fluky the streets saw. It was not the whole story. Behind the generosity was an operation running 20 to 40 drug houses at once, moving cocaine and heroin around the clock, with each house pulling in $20,000 to $60,000 a week. That put the organization's income at roughly $1 million every 7 days, and investigators later estimated the network was grossing more than $50 million a year. Around 200 people were on the payroll, and the whole thing was disguised behind a Southside pool hall. To the IRS, Fluky claimed he had no job at all. He said he made his living gambling, and he played the part well, flying to Las Vegas most weekends, known to win or lose $250,000 in a single trip. He never missed a night at the track. That was the cover story. Federal and local investigators knew better. A Chicago detective who tracked Fluky for years connected his name to 15 to 20 drug-related murders across the South Side through the 1970s and 80s. Bodies left in alleys, rivals who got too ambitious, dealers who skimmed product, people who talked to the wrong person at the wrong time. None of those cases were ever closed. Fluky treated violence as a tool rather than an identity, something used only when it was necessary, always without a trail leading back to him. At the same time, he understood the value of spectacle. Running $1 million a week operation meant people needed to see the boss, not the bodies. They needed the silk suits, the diamonds, the gambling story, and the image of a man who paid for funerals and sponsored basketball teams. That image was what built loyalty on the street and made Fluky feel untouchable. Investigators pointed to a handful of specific killings as examples of how far Fluky was willing to go to protect that territory. On May 26, 1984, a man named Leroy Dixon was shot in the head at a Southside barbershop after reportedly trying to move in on Fluky's drug turf. Around the same period, on Merrill Street, a dealer named Levert Handy was killed with a shotgun blast to the back of the head after reportedly attempting to sell dope in an area Fluky controlled. On July 30th, a man named Anthony Brown was shot through the heart in a parking lot after allegedly robbing one of Fluky's runners and then refusing to return the money. Police in each case pointed to Fluky as the man behind the violence, arguing he was protecting a multi-million-dollar operation and had his competition eliminated whenever it threatened him. A Chicago police commander who worked the area at the time put it plainly to investigators. They believed Fluky would do anything necessary to protect his empire, that he made his money dealing drugs and protected his interests any way he had to, and if that meant murder, so be it. None of these cases against Fluky personally ever resulted in a conviction, and that pattern, killings tied to his name by police but never resolved in court, repeated itself across nearly 2 decades, long before the Sarosky case gave prosecutors their first real chance to test it in front of a jury. That contradiction followed Fluky for his entire life, and it never fully resolved one way or the other. To much of the neighborhood, he functioned as something close to a Robin Hood figure, someone who took from an underground economy and put a visible share of it back into the community around him. To police and prosecutors, he was a drug dealer responsible directly or indirectly for a string of killings, someone who would stop at nothing, including murder, to protect what he had built. Both descriptions circulated at the same time, in the same newspapers, often about the same events, and which one a person believed usually said as much about where they stood in relation to Fluky as it did about Fluky himself. The organization itself ran on structure. Runners, somewhere between 30 and 50 of them, carried the product and could deliver anywhere in the city at any hour, equipped with pagers so they could be reached and dispatched the moment an order came in, effectively running a round-the-clock delivery service for cocaine and heroin the same way a legitimate courier company might run deliveries across town. Fluky limited each runner to no more than 2 ounces of product at a time, which reduced his losses if a runner got caught, made the supply easier to track, and meant no one got fronted more product until what they already had was paid for. Fluky himself stayed away from the drugs entirely and only handled the money, which came to him in gym bags, briefcases, and paper sacks counted at an office on East 47th Street. Much of what investigators eventually knew about the size of that counting operation came from a man inside it. Before he ever became Fluky's bodyguard, Earl Wilson had already worked undercover for police, quietly documenting roughly 6 weeks of the organization's day-to-day activity, including specific counting house totals. On one single day, runners reportedly brought in as much as $200,000 in cash, and on other days recorded totals ran from tens of thousands of dollars up to a single bag containing $40,000. Wilson would go on to play a far more direct role in Fluky's life several years later, one that would end it. His right-hand man, known as Big Bill Hill, was reportedly bringing in around $100,000 a week for the organization on his own, before he was caught in October 1983 carrying more than 100 packets of cocaine and heroin. Federal drug enforcement records later obtained by investigators describe just how deep Fluky's supply ran. At one point, he was reportedly trying to bring on an enforcer, a hitman named James Allen, to help protect the operation. And as part of that pitch, he showed Allen roughly 22 kilos of heroin at a single stash house, product estimated to be worth more than $60 million. That a man running what he told the IRS was an unemployed gambler's life could casually walk a prospective hire through $60 million of product in one room says as much about the scale of the operation as any of the individual dollar figures investigators later compiled. Fluky was arrested dozens of times over the years, with charges ranging from drug violations to murder, but he served only about a single year behind bars across his entire criminal history, an outcome that stood out even more given how openly his organization operated for most of 2 decades. Investigators later said the reason went beyond luck. Some Chicago police officers were working to build a case against him, while others, they allege, were feeding him confidential police reports and inside information, with informants reportedly reaching all the way into the detective division at Area 1. Fluky reportedly kept stacks of police paperwork on raids and search warrants that he had no legitimate reason to possess, and he was known to point out officers on the street to his bodyguards and tell them not to worry because those officers were his friends. Knowing which units were working late and where let him stay a step ahead without needing to run from anyone. That kind of access meant Fluky was rarely surprised by a raid, rarely caught with product in a location police did not already expect to find empty, and rarely without enough warning to move money or people before officers arrived. In one incident that investigators found especially telling, Fluky was stopped by Las Vegas police during a gambling trip to Caesar's Palace and found to be carrying Chicago police mugshots of the suspects in his own son's murder, official investigative material he had no ordinary way of possessing. Prosecutors who investigated him believed he was not just paying off individual officers for favors, but attempting to build influence across much of the department itself. In 1985, he was convicted of bribery for offering police $10,000 in exchange for reports naming the sole witness in a separate murder case, and he was out on an appeal bond for that conviction when he was killed. Some of the men who worked closest to Fluky described the gap between the two versions of him directly. Away from the business, they say, he was warm and unguarded, someone who taught the younger men around him rather than intimidated them. In the street, that same man carried a different reputation entirely, one built around fear and respect rather than warmth. People who knew him from that side of his life have said the organization ran on a small, tight circle rather than a large crew. Gordon Battle, known as Chip, who was treated as Fluky's likely successor and lived in a heavily secured house on the far south side, Big Bill Hill, described as an elder statesman of the operation who could handle dice as smoothly as he handled money, and Willie Jr. himself, the smallest of the group in size but not in reputation. None of them operated under a specific street gang banner, and that, according to people close to the organization, was deliberate. Staying unaffiliated let them do business with anyone, in a city where territory was normally drawn along gang lines. That kind of earning opportunity had not always existed for Black organized crime figures in Chicago. Earlier generations of organized crime in the city, largely built and controlled by the Italian mob, had operated with far more institutional backing, while Black economic opportunity through much of the 20th century had been steered toward low-wage work or petty crime. Fluky came up in an environment shaped by that history, watching the older mob-style model of organized crime and adapting pieces of it, the discipline, the discretion, the emphasis on structure, to build something of his own on the South Side. Chicago in that era also had some of the largest and most organized street gangs in the country. The Gangster Disciples, the Black P. Stone Rangers, and the Vice Lords among them, each with real influence over specific neighborhoods and corners. Fluky's organization operated apart from all of them, unaffiliated with any single gang, which by most accounts was central to how it managed to move product and collect debts across so much of the South Side without becoming entangled in the gang rivalries that defined much of the surrounding drug trade. People close to Willie Jr. and Chip described the bond between the two as close to a brotherhood, one built on the same streets and the same lessons their fathers had taught them. That closeness is part of what made the years that followed harder to watch. As the group around Fluky matured, the same loyalty that had once held them together began to fracture, particularly between Chip and his own brother, known on the street as Grass, with tension building over money and position inside the operation as the two men grew older and grew apart. It would not stay contained for long, and it would eventually turn deadly within Fluky's own inner circle, long before anyone outside that circle ever pulled a trigger on Fluky himself. By the mid-1980s, Fluky Stokes was not simply a drug dealer. He was regarded as one of the most successful and flamboyant figures in Chicago's criminal history, seemingly protected on every side by loyalty on the street, by silence from witnesses, and by friends inside the department meant to bring him down. But in February 1984, the empire took its first real hit, and it did not come from police or from a rival. It came from the murder of his own son. Willie Stokes Jr. was 28 years old, and on the street he was known as the Wimp, though there was nothing soft about the name once you knew him. He moved weight for his father, gambled the same way his father did, and dressed the part too, reportedly driving a brand new Cadillac every year for 8 years straight. He had a wife and 5 children, and by all appearances, a future carved out in the family business. On February 22, 1984, Willie Jr. drove to the Roberts Motel on the South Side to check a heroin shipment. The kind of routine quality control trip he had made many times before. He never made it inside. Multiple shooters opened fire on him in the parking lot. He was hit and survived for 3 days before dying on February 25th. There were no arrests and no suspects, and the case went cold almost immediately. Part of what made the killing hard to solve was timing. Crack cocaine was spreading fast through American cities in the early 1980s, cheap enough to reach a much wider customer base than powder cocaine or heroin ever had, and it brought in a younger, more reckless kind of dealer, one without patience for the older, more calculated rules that men like Fluky had built their operations around. Where Fluky's generation valued discretion, limited exposure, and long-term relationships with suppliers and buyers, the dealers coming up around crack were operating on shorter timelines and far less caution, treating territory disputes as something to be settled immediately rather than negotiated. Investigators suspected Willie Jr. had been caught in that shift, that younger dealers looking to make a name for themselves and take territory had gone after the Kingpin's son to send a message, but no one talked and no one came forward. Not everyone who knew Willie Jr. accepted the assumption that the killing was purely business. Some who were close to the family described it as something closer to a personal dispute gone wrong, involving a woman Willie Jr. was seeing at the hotel and a confrontation that escalated late at night rather than a calculated hit tied to territory. That account never became part of the official record, and the case was never solved either way, but it reflects how differently the people who actually knew Willie Jr. and the investigators looking at his death from the outside understood what happened to him. People who spent time around Fluky and Willie Jr., away from the business side of their lives, described a much more ordinary relationship than the headlines suggested. Some remembered being driven around the South Side by the two of them, along 47th Street and 63rd Street, stopping at a restaurant near 79th and Jeffrey, and watching Fluky hand out money to people on the street without being asked. The same generosity that had built his reputation among older residents extending just as easily to the younger men who spent time around him and Willie Jr. By these accounts, the family's day-to-day reputation in the neighborhood, including with Fluky's daughter Sabrina and the rest of the household, was built around generosity rather than violence, and people who knew them this way pushed back on the idea that everything attributed to Fluky and his son was really about killing. In their telling, it was about making money, plain and simple, and whatever reputation followed them for violence was, in their view, exaggerated by outsiders looking to make the story sound more dangerous than it was. That account exists alongside the police record, not in place of it, and the contrast between the two says something about how differently Fluky was seen depending on which side of the transaction a person stood on. Fluky did not respond to his son's killing the way most fathers would. When reporters asked him about Willie Jr., he talked about character and loyalty rather than the drug business, describing him as a well-liked young man. He also mentioned that his son had once sold his own Cadillac to help him out of debt, and that he felt he owed him for it. A quiet, private funeral was never on the table. Fluky had spent years building an image around spectacle, and his son's funeral became the largest expression of it. He reportedly spent around $7,000 on the casket alone, commissioning a custom coffin built to resemble Willie Jr.'s favorite car, a 1984 Cadillac Seville. The casket maker agreed to the design, and Fluky then took the coffin to a body shop and had it finished like an actual vehicle. A genuine Cadillac grille, a working trunk, headlights and taillights that blinked on cue, full white wall tires mounted on the frame, a plastic windshield, a steering wheel, a complete dashboard, and a vanity plate reading WIMP. By the time it was done, it no longer resembled a coffin at all. The viewing took place at A.R. Leak Funeral Home at 78th and Cottage Grove, and people lined up around the block, many of them drawn less by grief than by curiosity about something no one had seen before. Inside, Willie Jr. was positioned sitting upright in the Cadillac coffin rather than lying down, hands resting on the steering wheel. He wore a bright red suit and a tilted gray hat, diamond rings on his fingers, and several $100 bills tucked between them. The headlights blinked on and off throughout the viewing. Willie Jr.'s mother, Jean Stokes, told reporters at the time that she believed her son would have loved it, since he had always been flashy and had always believed in style. That comment, along with photographs of the casket, went out over wire services and appeared in newspapers across the country. It landed in the middle of the era's war on drugs messaging, at the same moment First Lady Nancy Reagan was fronting a national campaign telling children to just say no to drugs, and the contrast was hard for editors to ignore. A government-backed anti-drug message on one side, and a drug dealer's son buried in a car-shaped coffin with cash in his hands on the other. Talk shows discussed it. Preachers condemned it. Community members debated whether it amounted to a celebration of life or a glorification of the life that had gotten him killed. Fluky, by most accounts, did not care about the debate. He had set out to make sure his son's name would not be forgotten, and it worked. The story did not stay contained to Chicago. In Austin, Texas, songwriter Bill Carter came across a syndicated newspaper account of the funeral and immediately recognized its potential as a song rather than just a story. Working with his wife and co-writer Ruth Ellsworth, Carter reportedly had the entire song written during the short drive to their studio. Verses, chorus, and bridge worked out almost as fast as they could talk it through, and the two recorded it the same day, treating the funeral itself as the framework for the lyrics rather than inventing anything beyond what had already been reported. In 1985, Carter released Willie the Wimp and his Cadillac Coffin on his album Stomping Grounds, with Jimmy Vaughan playing lead guitar, and the song laid out the funeral almost detail for detail. The Cadillac grille, the flaming red suit, the cash between his fingers, the blinking headlights. It moved through the Texas blues circuit on club gigs and radio play, delivered without judgment of Willie Jr. one way or the other, simply narrating what had happened. Stevie Ray Vaughan heard Carter's version and decided to record it himself, giving it a heavier, more electric treatment. In July 1986, Vaughan released his live recording of Willie the Wimp on the album Live Alive, and the song became a blues rock staple almost immediately, picked up by radio stations and MTV. A 28-year-old Southside drug dealer's son had, without anyone involved fully realizing it, become part of American music history. 2 years later, in 1988, Vaughan performed the song live at the Midfins Festival in Denmark, in front of a crowd singing along to a story about a Cadillac coffin most of them had never seen, and a man they had never met. None of it accounted for what came next. 3 months after Vaughan's version of the song was released, Fluky Stokes himself would be dead, killed the same year the song about his son's funeral became a hit. and in the time between his son's burial and his own, Fluky's empire had already started to come apart at the seams, under legal pressure from multiple directions at once. In January 1985, less than a year after burying his son, Fluky threw another lavish event, this time to celebrate 30 years of marriage to his wife, Jean. He reportedly spent around $200,000 renting out a Southside hotel ballroom and hiring two nationally known soul acts, the Staple Singers and the Chai Lights, for the occasion. Hundreds of guests packed the room, dressed in their finest, drawn as much by the spectacle of a Fluky Stokes event as by the anniversary itself. Fluky and Jean renewed their wedding vows in front of the crowd, and then Fluky did what he was known for, walking through the room and throwing $50 and $100 bills into the air, guests scrambling across the ballroom floor to grab what they could as the cash drifted down around them. Before the party, he had reportedly described it to reporters as a modest affair. What stood out most was the location. The hotel where the anniversary party took place was the same one where Willie Jr. had been shot the year before. Whether returning there was an act of defiance, a way of reclaiming the space, or simply indifference, it reflected how little seemed to be off limits to Fluky, even his own grief. While the party was happening, the walls were already closing in from multiple directions: legal, financial, and criminal, each one independent of the others, but all converging on Fluky at roughly the same time. On August 1st, 1984, a Southside pharmacist named Robert Sarowski was shot and killed outside his home. Quinine was the substance dealers used to stretch a limited heroin supply into a much larger, more profitable volume of product, and Sarowski had reportedly been supplying it to Fluky and other Southside dealers for years, moving as much as 50 pounds a month at his peak. By 1984, that number had reportedly dropped sharply, down to 25 pounds and then to 5, as Sarowski appeared to be pulling back from his existing customers to go into the cutting agent business on his own. Police believe Fluky ordered the killing rather than lose that supply relationship to a competitor. In February 1986, Fluky was indicted on charges including murder, conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation, armed violence, and armed robbery. The case against him rested heavily on 3 witnesses, including a self-described hitman named Daryl Moore, who claimed Fluky had paid $10,000 to have Sarowski killed. Moore was himself a convicted rapist who had told detectives he helped arrange the pharmacist's killing on Fluky's behalf, and his credibility, along with that of the other 2 witnesses, became the entire foundation of the prosecution's case heading into trial. The trial began on August 18, 1986, in a packed courtroom, but it collapsed almost as soon as it started. All 3 witnesses recanted their earlier statements on the stand, claiming they had lied and that police had pressured them into their original accounts. Prosecutors were left with no case at all once their own witnesses turned against them, and with 3 self-described hitmen unwilling to repeat their statements under oath, there was no way to salvage a prosecution built almost entirely on their testimony. The charges were dropped, and Fluky walked out of the courthouse in his usual diamonds and gold, his custom Cadillac waiting outside. When reporters asked whether he had actually committed the crimes police accused him of, he denied it and said, according to accounts at the time, that he planned to head to Las Vegas to gamble. He would be dead within 3 months. The state's case falling apart did not mean federal pressure eased up. The DEA had reportedly spent close to 2 years building a racketeering and tax evasion case against Fluky, and a grand jury indictment was expected within months, one that could have put him in prison for life if he was convicted. A federal racketeering and continuing criminal enterprise case worked differently than the state charges Fluky had beaten before. Rather than relying on a handful of witnesses tied to a single killing, it was built to target the entire structure of an organization at once: the money, the runners, the properties, the years of documented income that never matched what Fluky reported to the IRS. It was the kind of case that was much harder to unravel through recanted testimony because so much of it rested on financial records and patterns of activity rather than on any one person's word. For a man who had spent 2 decades staying a step ahead of local police through bribes and informants, a federal racketeering case represented a different kind of threat entirely, one that could not be managed the same way, through the same relationships, on the same terms. Despite the extravagant anniversary celebration with Jean only months earlier, Fluky was reportedly with his mistress, 31-year-old Diane Miller, on the night he was killed. By the fall of 1986, Fluky was a man under pressure on nearly every front at once, an active federal investigation closing in, a recent murder charge that had only barely fallen apart, at least one known rival with a bounty on his head, and underneath all of it, a bodyguard he had hired only weeks earlier who was working against him the entire time. He had spent 2 decades treating threats as something to be managed quietly, through money, through relationships, through the same discipline that had kept him out of prison for most of his adult life. None of that discipline extended to the man riding in the car behind him. The man who was supposed to be protecting Fluky that final night was Earl Wilson, 33 years old, a divorced father of 5 who worked security at a Southside skating rink before Fluky hired him as a part-time bodyguard in October 1986, only about 3 weeks before the murder. Wilson, however, was also a longtime police informant, reportedly filing daily reports to the state's attorney's office about everything Fluky did and everywhere he went, effectively drawing pay from both sides at once, a role that, as established earlier, he had already been playing in a different form for years before he ever carried a gun for Fluky. By the time Fluky brought him on as a bodyguard, Wilson had spent years learning the organization from the outside, watching how the money moved, who was close to Fluky, and who wanted him gone. Taking a job that put him physically at Fluky's side, at the exact moment multiple parties were reportedly looking for an opening, gave Wilson a position no outside hitman could have managed on his own. The setup came together through Elliot Taylor, a 34-year-old motorcycle gang member and boyhood friend of Wilson's, who was said to have connections to people who wanted Fluky dead. The arrangement was reportedly simple: forgive Wilson's outstanding drug debt, provide him with a stolen car phone, and cover the phone bill, all together worth around $800 in exchange for setting up the hit. Prosecutors who worked the case believed Wilson wanted Fluky removed so a new figure, possibly himself, could take over the drug network, effectively positioning himself to become the next power on the South Side rather than simply collecting a payout for the setup. There was also pressure building from another direction. Charles Edward Bay, a 42-year-old former Fluky bodyguard who had gone into business as a rival dealer, survived an ambush in an alley in September 1986, hit by automatic weapon fire alongside an associate, and was believed by police to have put a $50,000 bounty on Fluky's head afterward. In what looked like retaliation for an earlier hit, police believed Fluky had ordered against him and an associate. Bay's split from Fluky reportedly came after their interests in Southside territory became mutually exclusive, the same dynamic that had turned other former allies into rivals over the years. And by late 1986, that rivalry had escalated into an open, if unofficial, fight over turf, waged through ambushes and bounties rather than through any negotiation. Word on the street at the time was that some form of retaliation against Fluky was coming, and by most accounts, Fluky was aware of it too. On the evening of November 18, 1986, Fluky took Diane Miller to the movies, where the two watched the film Something Wild. Afterward, they stopped at an all-night convenience store near 79th and Calumet for popcorn before driving to her apartment near 79th, and Ellis, an unremarkable end to an ordinary night out. Earl Wilson followed behind in a separate tail car, supposedly watching for threats while reportedly relaying their location in real time to Elliot Taylor over the stolen car phone. That night, Fluky was dressed almost unrecognizably compared to his usual image, wearing sweatpants and a plain jacket instead of silk and diamonds, without a single piece of jewelry on him. Whether that was a coincidence or a sign that some part of him sensed danger, no one has ever been able to say for certain. At 12:37 a.m. on November 19, 1986, as the car pulled up outside Diane Miller's building, 2 men stepped out from behind a parked vehicle and opened fire, one with a shotgun aimed through the windshield, the other with a handgun. Fluky's driver, 48-year-old Ronald Johnson, was killed in the shooting. Fluky was struck as well and died from his wounds, reportedly still holding his portable phone. Earl Wilson, waiting in the car behind them, fired several shots into the air rather than at the actual shooters, apparently to make it look like he had tried to intervene. Diane Miller, down in the back seat through the entire shooting, called out for Fluky once the gunfire stopped and heard nothing back. She had gone from spending an ordinary evening at the movies to becoming the only surviving witness to a professional hit, left to explain to police and eventually to a jury exactly what she had seen and heard in the seconds before and after the shots were fired. An anonymous caller who had been listening to a police scanner reportedly told investigators he had overheard Wilson on the car phone directing the gunman in the moments before the shooting, describing conversations in which Wilson told the shooters not to run and warned Fluky's people they would need a bodyguard of their own once it was over. That tip, combined with suspicion about Wilson's own account of events, firing shots into the air rather than at anyone actually involved in the ambush, led to his arrest on November 25, 1986, on 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted armed robbery, exactly 1 week after the shooting. At trial, Diane Miller took the stand dressed in a green velvet dress, pearls, and a white fur coat, and testified in detail about what she had witnessed that night, from reaching down for the grocery bags to hearing the gunfire and calling out for Fluky in the silence afterward. In December 1987, a jury convicted Earl Wilson on 2 counts of first-degree murder, and on January 8, 1988, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Elliot Taylor was never charged. The 2 gunmen who actually fired the shots were never identified, and Charles Edward Bay was never charged either. Of everyone connected to planning and carrying out the killing that night, only Wilson was ever convicted. The fracture inside Fluky's own circle had already turned deadly before he was killed. Chip and Grass, once described as inseparable, had drifted apart over money and standing inside the operation as they got older, and the falling out ended with Grass catching Chip off guard and shooting him at a pancake house near 51st and Lake Park. Chip died on the way to the hospital. The account comes from Chip's own son, who grew up idolizing his father and has said that losing him that way, at the hands of someone who had once been like a brother to him, shaped the rest of his life. He has said he came to forgive Grass over time, largely because Grass had remained close to the family for years afterward, but that forgiveness never undid what the killing cost him. It was one more sign that the disciplined Fluky had built the organization around. The idea that business stayed separate from personal loyalty had started breaking down even before federal agents or rival dealers made their move. Fluky's funeral, like his son's, was held at A.R. Leak Funeral Home, and roughly 7,000 people came to say goodbye, with lines wrapping around the block, mothers lifting children above the crowd so they could see the casket, young men in suits and older women in church hats packed shoulder to shoulder along the sidewalk. He was laid out in a mahogany coffin with a custom powder blue interior, dressed in a blue suit, blue silk shirt, tie and handkerchief, and blue python shoes, tinted sunglasses covering his eyes, and a portable telephone placed between his fingers, echoing the object he had been holding when he was shot. Outside the funeral home, vendors sold Fluky Stokes t-shirts to the crowd. He was buried at Oakwood Cemetery in the same crypt as his son. People who knew Fluky from the neighborhood, rather than from police files, described a different kind of man on the day of that funeral. One mourner, a young man from the area, later told reporters he had simply been walking down the same street as Fluky one day, introduced himself, and had Fluky shake his hand and speak to him like he mattered. That was the version of Fluky people in the neighborhood chose to remember that day. Not the murder charges, not the federal case waiting in the wings, just a man who had known their names. By the time Fluky died, federal investigators had reportedly spent roughly 2 years building a racketeering and tax evasion case against him, and were only months from an indictment that could have sent him to prison for the rest of his life. He never stood trial for any of it. With his death, control over an estimated $50 million a year drug network was left contested among several figures connected to his old operation, including a former partner known as Gordon Chip Battle, a rival named Chuck McFerrin, and a former associate named Sam Love Jr. Investigators reportedly believed McFerrin had positioned himself as the head of a newly formed cartel of independent dealers looking to move in on Fluky's territory, and that a meeting shortly before Fluky's murder between McFerrin and a suspected major narcotics supplier with reported organized crime ties in New York, Detroit, and South Florida may have been an early step toward a supply arrangement outside Fluky's old network. Investigators separately tied a large drug money seizure in a January raid on an apartment in Alsip to the Love family's operation, recovering roughly $500,000 in cash, mostly in 10s and 20s, the kind of unremarkable denominations that move easily through a street-level drug economy without drawing attention. Police at the time said they expected the fight over Fluky's old territory to continue for some time, since takeovers in that business rarely happen peacefully, and with 3 separate groups positioning themselves to inherit what Fluky had built, there was no reason to expect the Southside's drug trade to settle quickly or quietly in the months after his murder. Earl Wilson eventually walked out of prison on October 20th, 2023, after serving 37 years, following an appeal that reduced his original 60-year sentence. The 2 gunmen who actually fired the shots that killed Fluky and Ronald Johnson were never identified, and no one else involved in planning the murder ever faced a jury. Almost 40 years later, the question that circulated through Chicago newspapers while Fluky was still alive has never really been settled. whether he was closer to the generous, familiar figure the neighborhood remembered, or the calculating operator described in police files and federal investigations. Both accounts are documented. Both come from people who knew him in different capacities, and the truth likely sits somewhere in the overlap between them rather than cleanly on either side. What is not in dispute is how the story ended. A father who turned his son's funeral into a national spectacle and who was gunned down 2 years later by the one man on his payroll whose loyalty he never should have trusted in the first place. Fluky Stokes came up in an era when the drug trade, at least the way he ran it, still had rules, structure, discretion, a line between business and everything else. By the time he died, that line was already disappearing, pushed aside by a younger, more volatile generation of dealers who had no interest in the old hierarchy, and by the very people inside his own circle and his own police department who were supposed to be protecting him. Nearly 40 years after Willie Jr.'s Cadillac Coffin first made headlines, and decades after Fluky's own murder, the two men remain linked in Chicago's criminal history and in American music, through a blues song that still gets airplay and a story that outlasted almost everyone involved in it.